Tracy Anthony. I work for Grand Prairie Public School Division. I'm the Numeracy coordinator and have been for about 12 years. What I'm talking to you today about is the numeracy intervention for our at-risk students. There's three areas that I want to talk to you about today. The one area is we're going to look at a very broad overview of what the government screening numeracy assessment tool was, what GPPSD numeracy intervention is, and then we're going to get a little more specific about what GPPSD intervention looks like with our students at risk. What I would like to preface is that our intervention is going to be done with EAs, educational assistants. But this intervention is designed for EAs to deliver the instruction, not for our EAs to make judgments on the intervention data specific to students and their understandings. Where that comes in is that we'll have a series of stakeholders. So the classroom teacher, we have teacher leads for our intervention, the administrator, and in some cases our learning support teachers that will collectively meet to discuss students and student achievement. Alberta Education sent out to us in the early part of this school year a screening tool for literacy and numeracy to be done with our grades 1, 2, and 3 students. What we were looking for was to see where students were at in their understandings with certain skills. So the numeracy assessment that we're looking at is based around a student's understanding and knowledge of number. The assessment tool was comprised of 5 subtests, and those subtests were counting, number identification, number patterns, number lines, and computation or arithmetic. I want to note that some of the language that was used in this screening assessment may not be what we use in our current Alberta education curriculum, but the big ideas are there and are embedded in our specific outcomes. The first subtest was called comparing numbers. So counting is one of the earliest mathematical skills that our young students learn. However, counting from 1 to 100 in a rote manner is not what we mean when a child can do math. Counting needs to involve an understanding of its purpose, and a count's purpose is quantity. So quantity gives our numbers meaning. So the big idea with comparing numbers subtest was that we wanted to measure students' knowledge of the number symbol and the quantity of those symbols. Students were expected to cross out the highest quantity number in the set. So in this case, 4 has more of a quantity than 3, the number would be crossed out. So students were given 30 questions on the sheet and 30 seconds to complete the task. The idea behind it was not to see that students could do all the numbers in the given amount of time. That was for norming purposes. What we were more interested in is what questions students were crossing out correctly and what their misconceptions were. Writing numbers was the second subtest. What we wanted from our students with this subtest was to make connections between the verbal number word and the quantity it corresponded to. So the big idea that we wanted to take away from this subtest was that writing numbers measures a student's fluidity and their ability to translate verbally to a written digits. Students were given a sheet that contained alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, and beside the A, they were expected to write a number that was given to them verbally. Where their A was, another spot on the grid, they were asked to write the number 14. So the child would write 14. For B, 26. As the numbers progress, they get more difficult. So eventually, we would ask a student to write 205. We're looking for several things here. One, we're wanting to make sure that the student isn't reversing their digits. 2, when we are looking at 0 as a placeholder, many of our students wrote how they heard it, 205. This tells us that they don't have a solid understanding of our place value system being base 10. The third subtest on the government assessment was called Numbers on the Number Line. And the connection here was for ordinal number and proportional reasoning. Was a student was given a number line, for instance, from 0 to 1,000, and they were given one number. So the number may have been 420. What students were expected to do was, given what they know, be able to place 420 on the number line in the approximate area where it would be. So it's not quite halfway, but it's close to half. Students were then scored based on where the proximity was of their tick. So if they were within this circle, they would have scored 2 points. If their tick was within this circle, they would have scored 1. And if it was outside this zone of proximity, then the score would have been 0. We certainly want students to understand the benchmarking that would go with a number line, so then that would be a nice tool for them to use when they are, again, doing more complicated mathematical problems. Number facts was the fourth subtest, and it is exactly what it says. We had addition and subtraction facts. Students were also timed in this area, and we were again looking just to see what facts students have where there is automaticity, which means that they are able to know the fact and trust that it is a certain quantity. So do students trust that 1 plus 2 is 3? Do students trust that 9 plus 1 is 10? The other area that we're looking for with the number facts is the idea of deriving facts. So if a child knows that 9 plus 1 is 10, from that known fact, can they derive the fact that 9 plus 2 must be 11? If a child knows that 4 plus 4 is 8, that's a known fact. Can the child then derive that 4 plus 5 is then 9? The fifth test, subtest that we were looking at was called ordering numbers. And what that subtest was for was to measure students' knowledge about sequential relations with our base 10 system. So the big idea was for students to be able to order numbers in our base 10 sequence, but not necessarily neighboring numbers. Students were expected to decipher whether a series of numbers was in proper sequence, either ascending or descending, or not. For instance, on the sheet, the children would have had a rectangle with several boxes inside. There may have been this sequence given, 4, 1, and 3. The child would have to quickly look at that and determine that is in ascending order or is not. If it is not, they would mark it with an X. If the sequence of numbers was in proper order, 4, 6, 10, the child would mark that with a check mark. This was a timed subtest, so there wasn't time afforded for students to write out the proper sequence. So the check mark and the X were a quick way of assessing. So now that we have gone through the subtests, what we did as a division was take a deeper look into the student data. With the student data, what we were looking for students that were below what the government had decided on to be the cut score. Those students were red flagged with us across our division. From there, each school site then decided on, of those red flags, what students would be most beneficial for a daily intervention process. So not every child that was red flagged was in our intervention for various reasons. Some may have a learning disability, some may have had attendance issues. Students in certain categories may not have been the best fit. The intervention itself was broken into 3 pillars. So the first pillar was mini lessons. So given the time frame and the attention span of the students that we have, the intervention was broken down into 20 to 25 minute lessons, but daily. The other pillar we're looking at is that we wanted to capture the student data so that we had evidence of what the student's progression was, and more specifically, what the misconceptions were of the students. What we created was what we called a math mat, and all the work of the students are captured on this math mat. Each mat has a range of numbers. So one math mat, we're looking at numbers from 1 to 10. A different math mat, we're looking at numbers from 1 to 20. And a third math mat, we're looking at numbers from 1 to 100. That mat specifically is just for our third grade students. Any child that is in first or second grade that is having difficulty with those numbers, it is developmentally appropriate and specific to our curriculum. So our 1 to 100 mat again is for our third grade students. The third pillar is that we want to assess where students are at. So once we've done the intervention, then we want to look at some form of weekly assessment that students will complete independently. From that assessment, we will capture some raw data, and then from there, our stakeholders will have a conversation about what students will require next, possibly student movement, and or if they can be released back into the classroom. Our intervention was developed over a 12-day cycle. On day 1, our EAs are delivering instruction specific to the number line. On day 2, our EAs are delivering specific instruction to compare number. On day 3, our EAs are delivering specific instruction to computation. And on day 4, our EAs are delivering specific instruction to ordering number. All of that data is then captured on a math mat. The idea behind this math mat is that the students are seeing the same format, and so that they are getting, repetition and practice, even though the number on the math mat may change. So on day 5 and 6, the math mat is done in its entirety. So a student would still get instruction, but the instruction would come with all subtests at one time. Days 7 and 8, students are matched in pairs, and they are given a math mat to work on collectively. The students are matched for their commonalities, if possible. Our day 9 and 10 lessons are then independent. So each student will be given the math mat that they have seen throughout these 2 weeks. However, each student will be given a different number. And so they are to be working with that number independently on their specific math mat. Day 11, we would like to assess where our students are at now that they've had almost 2 weeks of explicit instruction. Once we have that data, our stakeholders have dialogue about student movement. From there, students are then just given the math mat every time they show up for intervention. After 3 independently done math mats, students are then re-evaluated. From that evaluation, again, the same stakeholders have dialogue about specific students and where they move. For some of our students, it might mean that their math mat now moves to a 1 to 20 math mat from a 1 to 10. For some of our students, it may mean that their transition back to the classroom is finalized, that their intervention is no longer required. One of the tasks that our educational assistants have been given is to track data on a Google form. For instance, in Compare Number, there may be 9 tasks on the 1 to 10 math mat. On the Google form, the educational assistant would then input the raw score for that child in that subtest. So if a child was to receive 5 out of 9, I would get the information that the child has gotten 5 correct. What this allows for us as stakeholders is to dive deeper. So what we want is to know what the child did well in, but also where their misconceptions fall. This is where we would look at the completed math mats of each student to then diagnose what the next steps are. If we have a student who has a solid understanding of 9 being greater than 1, but wavers when looking at a number such as 9 comparative to 8, a child who doesn't have fluency may have to then finger count to go, okay, there's my 8, and then finger count again, there's my 9, I see 9 is bigger than 8. Not that they didn't get the right answer, but the fluidity is not there in numbers 1 through 10. Each subtest is then captured on our Google form, and then from there we can upload the Google form to a spreadsheet. And within our spreadsheet, then we can have all of our students in our division that are in intervention, and we can start to monitor what their progression is. If some students are not progressing, we can have conversations specific to their needs. If students are progressing at a pace that we would expect, then some may be discharged sooner than later. To conclude, our main focus at Grand Prairie Public was to offer our students that need more a very targeted, specific, scaffolded set of lessons around number in hopes that we can tighten some understandings that when they're back in their classrooms, transference can happen.